If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. So Proton, when did you first become interested in aviation?
So my dad was a Marine aviator, flew A4s in Vietnam, and then he subsequently became an airline pilot. And so I was sort of raised with aviation in my blood. I went through, my schooling, elementary and high school, and into college. I just wanted to be a professional athlete, like most American kids. Played baseball, football, basketball in high school, and a little baseball in college. But I always had aviation sort of in my blood and in my background. And so I was about 20, ironically, my son's exact age right now, about the exact same time of his life, where I sort of woke up one day and had an epiphany and said, the chasing the professional athlete dream would be cool. This is something that I'm much more interested in. And I just decided at that point that that's what I wanted to do.
Brilliant stuff. So can you tell us the process of you going through the US Navy and to becoming a Hornet pilot?
Sure. So call sign Proton comes from when I joined the Navy. I was a nuclear reactor operator. So I joined, I became enlisted, and I went in through that pipeline. It was the arduous and more difficult road, but it was the path that was available to me at the time. Essentially, the goal was to get to where I ended up fortunately getting to. And so I went through boot camp and A school and the nuclear power school and nuclear power prototype all the time, sort of applying, trying to get into aviation, running into many, many obstacles. And then finally, it just takes one person to say yes. And so when I got the yes and the door cracked, I went sprinting through it. And then went down to Pensacola, Florida, where they do aviation pre-flight. At the time, I was aviation officer candidate school. Spent about 3 months there, and then went from there to Corpus Christi in primary flight training, and that was ground school, and then T-34s. Sorry, Charlie and Rhino say hello to your viewership. They're over there. I'm sure they'll end up on camera at some point, but. Went through primary in T-34s in Corpus Christi. Was fortunate enough to select jets out of that, and then spent the rest of my time in training command, flying T-2s and A4s, which was cool because of my father's connection in Kingsville, Texas. Got my wings in August of 1993. Stop. August of 1993, and then was fortunate enough to have done well enough that I was able to select what I wanted. I wanted to be an F-18 pilot from the beginning. I think my dad, being a single seat guy, probably had some influence on that. At that time, F-14, F-18 were kind of neck and neck what individuals want to fly. Remember, this is 1993 timeframe, so Top Gun 1 had come out in 86, and so that still had a massive influence on guys going through flight school and what they wanted to fly. But I was pretty much from the beginning, I wanted to be a single seat guy. So selected F-18s, and away I went from there.
Brilliant stuff. So what were your first thoughts on the Hornet?
I remember, first off, just being really excited that I was going to get to fly in this airplane. So I went through the what's known now as the Fleet Replacement Squadron in El Toro, California, which was a Marine base. And I got out there a few months prior to starting. There's kind of a story there that's immaterial to this, but I got out there and I got in the back seat. I got a ride, and I just remember being completely overwhelmed that, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to fly this, and this is my career. Flying, T-34s, T-2s, and A4s was fantastic, but they were analog legacy airplanes. And then I step into a state-of-the-art glass digital platform that was, afterburning and very maneuverable and could do all sorts of things. And I just remember thinking that was the coolest thing I could possibly do. And truth was, it was the coolest thing I could possibly do. And I was just blessed to stay in that for 25 years beyond that. So
wow, impressive.
Yeah.
So what was the aircraft like to fly? And was your first squadron an A squadron or was it a C squadron?
It was a C squadron. It was a sports car, and it was interesting because I spent the last part of my career flying the Super Hornet. I was in command of a squadron, an E squadron, and ironically, I had the first Royal Navy exchange pilot in my squadron. I could tell that story later. But the transition from flying the Legacy, and I flew all 4 variants, A through D. And then E's and F's. It was the Legacy was a sports car. I grab the stick; it gives me what I want immediately. Whereas the Super Hornet, it's a bigger plane. It's much more of an SUV type of thing. It grabs it, and the plane's like, "Well, I'm a little smarter than you are," which was true. And I'm going to think about what you're actually asking for, and then I'm going to provide the input so you don't mess it up here. But it was quick. It was maneuverable. And even to this day, I chose a blessed career. My last job in the Navy, I was the wing commander in Oceania on the East Coast, and I had the entire flight line to fly from A's to F's. And I chose my last flight in a C, go out like I came in, because it was maneuverable, it was sexy, it was fun. Behind the boat, if from a naval aviator standpoint, if I'm dogfighting, I want to be in a C. If I am bombing, I want to be in a Super Hornet, just because it's bigger. I can carry more weapons. The symbology, all the things were better, and the Super Hornet certainly more advanced. But if I'm just trying to maneuver an airplane and fight it, and even for me, landed on the ship, I would rather be in the smaller, quicker version than the Super Hornet.
Absolutely. And we're here to talk about Top Gun, but before we get onto that, what squadrons were you with before you went to be a student at the Fighter Weapons School?
My first squadron was VFA 146, the Blue Diamonds, out of Lemoore, California. And so the way it works is you do, from movie 1 to movie 2, things had changed. But and I was more on the movie 2 side of things in terms of career progression than movie 1. Movie 1, guys would go off mid-tour, go to Top Gun for 5 weeks and come back to that squadron. The way it works now, movie 2, and where I was kind of on the leading edge of that, about a year and a half into the new program, was you do a full tour of 3 years. For me, 3 years, 2 deployments, selected to go to Top Gun and then off to Top Gun, and then not necessarily go back to my original squadron. I'm going to do a student at Top Gun, an instructor at Top Gun, and then wherever the chips may fall is where I would go back, and I did not end up going back to 146.
So let's get into Top Gun. So can you tell us a bit of background from about Top Gun, and what was it originally designed for, and is it the same today?
Sure. Great question. And it's funny because with the movie and my history with the school, there was still, I don't think it's necessarily now, but there was still for a very, very long time just an assumption that Top Gun was a Hollywood thing and not really an actual organization, a brick and mortar schoolhouse. So the genesis of Top Gun, World War II, Korean War, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aircrew had a roughly 10 to 12 to 1 kill ratio. So for every good guy we lose, we shoot down 10 to 12 bad guys. We step into the Vietnam conflict, and technology has moved on, and we're fighting, definitely less technologically advanced platforms that the North Vietnamese were flying, and even the Chinese are supplying, or the Russians are supplying into that conflict. And the kill ratio, which had started at 10 to 12 to 1, over the course of time in the 60s started diminishing. And by the time we hit 67, 68, in some cases it had flipped where it was 1 to 2. An F-4 Phantom, which the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force were flying at that time, the most technologically advanced plane in the world, was losing to inferior MiGs. So there's a hiatus in the Air War in 1968. Hiatus in the Air War in 1968, sorry. At that time, the Chief of Naval Operations they were trying to figure out what was going on. And so they tasked a gentleman named Frank Alt, who was a captain, to go off and conduct a study and figure out what's going on. So Captain Alt goes off and he does tons of research. He talks to acquisition professionals and aircrew and operators and really kind of the whole kit and caboodle. And he comes back with what is known as, famously, the Alt report, not surprisingly. And in the Alt report, he determines that the reason for aircrew performance over the preceding 4 or 5 years is due to a lack of knowledge, general lack of knowledge over the threat aircraft and what it could do, the threat weapons and what could it do, what the Phantom could do, what the Phantom weapons could do. Additionally, he found a host of other issues, the acquisition timelines and procuring the wrong weapons, et cetera, et cetera. But in that report, he had a list of recommendations. And this recommendation number one was to stand up a graduate level schoolhouse to teach advanced kind of tactics and weapons, et cetera. And so out of that, the Chief of Naval Operations directed that VF-121, which was the F-4 Phantom Fleet Replacement Squadron in Miramar, would stand up an advanced tactics cell, if you will. And so the very first individual charged was Lieutenant Commander Dan Pedersen, call sign Yank, and the CO of 121 went to Yank and said, figure this out, you've got it. Don't care what you do. And this is, remind you, this is 1968, 1969. So, there was not the standard procurement and military contracting timelines, et cetera. So Yank grabbed 8 guys, we call them the original 9. They grabbed a trailer, put it outside the hangar of VF-121, procured a couple of chalkboards, liberated a safe for 2, and on March 3rd, 1969, opened the doors of the very first class, which was 2 Phantom air crews, so a pilot and a Wizzo, and started teaching Navy Fighter Weapon School and Navy Fighter Weapon School tactics. I went into a bar, and you can see I'm wearing the shirt here. On a bar napkin drew this patch that still exists to this day, awesome. The Miramar Oak Club. Yeah. And away it went. And so they taught a number of classes. The air war kicked back off. And hey, stop. The air war kicks back off. And the proof is in the pudding. By the end of the Vietnam War, the kill ratio had bounced back to about 14-1. Wow. Based upon that. So, there's a peacetime dividend that usually ensues after some sort of conflict. And so there was some thought downsizing and getting rid of it, but they literally had to look and see, okay, here's the success here. The Air Force saw the success. They established their own weapons school now in Nellis. And it just grows and grows and grows to the point where now we're at 54 years of the doors being open, and Topgun is, in fact, the model. It's the model for naval aviation across all communities. It's the model for the Navy writ large across aviation, surface, subsurface, special warfare, intel, supply, believe it or not. When I was the commanding officer at Topgun, there was a direction that there was a need to broaden how every warfighting community does business. And so we're taking stream raids of Navy admirals to come in and say, okay, what exactly do you do here? This is our community. We've never done this. So how do we figure this out? So that has become the model, and it continues to this day.
Brilliant stuff. So let's talk about your time as a student there. How did that happen? Did you apply, or did they come to you? If you can walk us through that, Proton.
I'm coming to the end of my very first tour. So I'm from Southern California. My dad is an airline pilot at the time. It's pre 9/11, and I'm not entirely sure. This is the spring summer of 1997. So I'm, what do I want to do with my life? I don't know. I lived in Lemoore, California. Lemoore is near Fresno. It's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. And my family is Northern and Southern California. So my original thought process was, I really love flying fighters. I think it'd be cool to be a Blue Angel. And so maybe I'll give that a go. I'll go down to what I want to do is I'll go down and be an instructor at the Fleet Replacement Squadron I was had gone through, which had been subsequently had moved from El Toro. The Navy had given up Miramar by that point. So the Marine Corps had moved down, taken over Miramar. And so me and my peers said, like, oh, wouldn't it be great to fly F-18s out of San Diego? Maybe rush the Blue Angels, maybe not. See what happens out of that. And if nothing happens, then go become an airline pilot. Because that was just sort of the path that most of my peers were on. So I was squadron. We are training in Fallon, which is where Top Gun had moved to. I have a mentor in my squadron, a guy named Tom Downing, call sign Trim, who's a legend in naval aviation. And so unbeknownst to me, Trim is sort of evaluating me and the other guys in the squadron, and he assesses that I have the ability to possibly be a Top Gun A student and be an instructor. Mm-hmm. So we happen to be in Fallon doing some training, and the manning officer at Top Gun at the time, a guy named Jeff Winter, call sign Chili, who's still a really close friend of mine, comes up, introduces himself. Hey, have you ever thought about Top Gun? Sure. What? So I was then faced with okay, do I go down to San Diego and fly F-18s and surf, or do I go to Fallon and work really hard, don't get me wrong, as cool as an instructor, or do I go to Fallon, Nevada? So San Diego, live in La Jolla, Solana Beach, Pacific Beach, as a late 20s guy, single guy, or do I go to Fallon, Nevada, which is 60 miles east of Reno, and a town of 20,000, a very, very small town, and really, really work hard. And I remember vividly having a conversation with my dad. And I was like, I'm very fortunate I had options. And my dad said, you will have other opportunities in your life to perhaps, if you stay in, to go be an instructor, an F-18 instructor in one of the fleet replacement squadrons. You're going to have one shot to go to Top Gun. And it was I was, this epiphany and like, holy smokes, you're right. And so that was sort of the deciding line. And I remember the detailer calls me on midsummer of 97 and says, okay, I need an answer. And I said, I'm going to Top Gun. And he goes, congratulations. And then I thought, oh my God, what have I got myself into? And so I went on deployment. A couple weeks after that, left in the middle of deployment, went to Fallon and started a 10-week grind as a student. Being a student at Top Gun is, having gone through it and then having instructed it now twice, it is the most difficult thing you can possibly do in an airplane. There's a thing that the Navy and the Marine Corps put there, and actually the U.S. services put, it's called SEER School. Are you familiar with SEER School? Have you heard of it? Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. It's basically a POW school where you go off and you try to survive, and then you get captured, and then you go through, what it's like to be a POW, and then you learn all these lessons. It's a really, really hard school. It's short. It's physically and mentally challenging, but you learn a lot out of it. You learn a lot about yourself and what you can withstand, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm fond of saying that Top Gun as a student is like SEER School with jets, because it is really hard. You learn a lot. It's physically demanding. It's mentally demanding. And the bar is high for a reason. When I showed up as a student, I had never, ever failed a test, a flight, a sim, anything. I had always passed everything I'd ever done. My second flight at Top Gun, I failed 3 times. My third flight at Top Gun, I failed twice. And by the 5th failure, I remember vividly calling my dad, hey, how's it going? And I was like, I don't think I'm gonna make it. And He was like, are you? I'm like, yeah, these guys are kicking my ass. And fortunately, I kind of scrambled through it and made it through the rest of the way. But it was brutal. But the upshot of that is that, you back to the original, the deciding point. And Trim Downing was one of these advocates. Like, there are very, very few professional athletes in the world. And so full circle, I want to be a professional athlete. This Trim and my father and others, sort of people that I look up to and mentors, are like, yes, you're a great fighter pilot, but there's only one way you're really going to know how good you are. And it's to go be with other really, really good fighter pilots. And that will, iron sharpens iron kind of thing. And it was the best decision I ever made. brutal but rewarding, and just being around all of that talent for all those years certainly helped bring me to the point where I'm talking to you on this podcast.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some of the details here. So my ignorance if I ask any silly questions here, because I'm not clued up too much on Top Gun and the school and stuff like that. So when you go in as a student, you come in as an F-18 pilot, and that's all you fly, right?
Correct.
And do you fly their jets, or do you fly your squadron's jets?
Great question. So in the beginning, early phases, Top Gun, Miramar, when a squadron would send a pilot to Top Gun and an F-14 or an F-18 in the beginning, they would send a jet with that person.
Right.
That person would fly and then take the jet back. Top Gun had their own airplanes, mostly adversary airplanes. At that time, F-16s, F-5s, A-4s, etc. By the time it moves into Fallon, Nevada in the summer of 1996, that paradigm has shifted incredibly, so that it's a 10-week course. Aircrew are through their tour, so the fleet will send, the various wings will get a tasker. So you have an F-18 wing East Coast, F-18 West Coast. Top Gun class coming up, we need 10 F-18s. That's just a random number.
Okay.
We need 5 from this coast, 5 from that coast. Those jets will show up with maintenance and support crew, and the students will fly any of those 10 jets. It doesn't have to be. They typically will not have a jet from their squadron. Every once in a while it happens, but it's not off the Fallon flight line. The Fallon flight line itself still has plenty of aircraft, but most of them are not fleet representative planes, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So there's Super Hornets on the flight line, but they don't have the latest and greatest systems inside that you need to go through the Top Gun class. Sometimes they do. There's a couple. But by and large, those jets are used in an adversary role or as sort of a backup. Okay, this jet's gone. This just has maintenance issue. You need to go and jump on that aircraft. They also now do have F-35s on the line, because Top Gun has evolved from an F-18. When I went through, it was F-14, F-18, and then for a long time it was F-18 Legacy and Super Hornet, and now it's Super Hornet and F-35. So there are some F-35s on the Fallon flight line as well.
Before we get into a bit more detail here, Proton, did you actually live on base, or do you live off base?
As a student?
As a student, yeah.
As a student, I lived on base. I lived in the officers' quarters. Wake up in the morning, limp into Top Gun, get done at night, limp back to the BOQ. This back and forth. In fact, I don't think I left base much in that. So the class was 10 weeks then, based upon things I said earlier. Just days were long. After I graduated and then stayed on the staff as an instructor, then I lived out in town.
So when you arrive as a student, what's like day one? Is it like, this is where you're sleeping, 9 o'clock the next morning or whatever? Is it straight away, or do you get a bit of time to, get in there?
So notoriously, infamously, famously, depending on how you want to look at it, Top Gun always starts on a Monday, and It doesn't matter if it's a federal holiday or not. Started on a Memorial Day, has started on a Labor Day, started on a 4th of July. Like, really? The class intro, day one, is at 6:30 in the morning. So you can't arrive the day of. You typically get there, because it's a Monday, you get there. If you get there Sunday, you're in a lot of trouble. Typically, guys will show up Thursday, Friday, Saturday at the latest, get themselves settled, get themselves ready. Class intro, day one, it's the NAUTIC now, Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Center Admiral and the Top Gun commanding officer, and the training of the whole staff is there. You get, hey, welcome to Top Gun. Everybody, talks to you. Here's your books, and away you go. And then it's right off. You leave the auditorium, and it's right into a classroom, and academics start day one. Wow. There's really no time to reset. You go 6:30 in the morning, and then you finish that day probably 5. And then you do that. So you have academics the first week, and then you start working up into the flying aspect. The flying aspect is made up of basic fighter maneuvering, generally 1v1, like the original movie, that also sprinkles in some multi-plane concepts. And you do that. You don't do that in Fallon. You will go on detachment to a fleet concentration area, typically at sea level. So Fallon's at 4,000 feet. And the jets fight differently obviously, the lower they are. And so you typically want to go fight out over the water to get maximum performance capabilities and kind of, fight in the environment in which you're probably going to be fighting in. And so the staff, the students, and a number of airplanes will go to Oceana and Virginia Beach, to Lemoore in California, to Miramar, and go out there and fight out over the water, which also gives the Top Gun staff the ability to do guest lectures and evaluate the fleet, looking for future instructors, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a multi-beneficial evolution, and that's about 2 weeks now, and then come back and then get into multi-plane. Your first flight's a demo, like, hey, okay, you're going to go out and fly, and here's some of the concepts you're going to be thinking about, just kind of a warm up, because sometimes air crew will have, like I did, leave in the middle of deployment. So I left out Persian Gulf, so I had to get current again. You have to get so many flights, and so there's some warm up flights in there. If you're current, then you don't typically have to go through that process. And so the beginning phase is 1v1. And so, we do a lot of dogfighting. And so I felt like I was prepared for it, but I clearly was not prepared for it, because I left from deployment. And when you go on deployment, you're in combat, you're not doing dogfighting. You're doing operations. You're not doing training typically. And so I hadn't done any of that type of training in quite some time. It had been 6 or 7 months prior to me flying a 1v1. So I was getting slayed, and slayed, and then the doubt bug creeps in and we're spiraling away. And that was the point where I was like, oh my goodness, I felt like I was doing okay. And then the next thing I know, I start offensive and I end up defensive. And I'm like, oh my God, how did that just happen? Or I would start offensive, end up offensive, and not as offensive as I should be. And I'm trying to figure out exactly. So getting through that phase, once I got through that phase, Charlie, stop. Once I got through that phase, I was fine. We got into multi-plane, and something that I had done a ton of prior to coming to the class. So while it was really busy and there's a lot going on, I felt much more comfortable in that as a student than I did in because I was chipping away so much rust. And that was a lesson learned for me. Subsequently, I staff for 3 years. I leave and go do a training officer tour, and department head tour, and a command tour. And when I would have air crew that were getting ready to go to the Top Gun staff, I would ensure that we would invest a lot of time in those guys and gals to ensure, all right, you need to be prepared day one. First impression. Yes. You only get one chance to make first impression. Your briefing labs are tight. Your BFM is, not everybody is savant in the airplane, but there are certain things that you can teach and have folks be ready for that I frankly was not ready for when I kicked off the class as a student. As a student, so remember when I went through a student, it was 1998. Started in 98, January 98, graduated in March of 98, graduated in May of 98, February to May. And so it was F-18, F-14. So the first phase was the 1v1 phase, and there were 6 or 7 flights, defensive, offensive, high aspect, and then you get into the 2 against 1 concept, how to alternate, unsuspecting somebody jumps in, picks up a tally or a radar contact or a radar warning defense. How do you maneuver both aircraft in such a position that both stay alive and you take care of that guy expeditiously. After that phase ended, it was transitioned back into academics. So there's academics, which is weapons and some dogfighting, do the 1v1 phase, back into academics, which is now in the multi-plane, more weapons, more threat-based stuff. And then it became what we refer to as section phase, which in the Navy is 2 planes. The Air Force calls it 2-ship. Navy calls it section. And so that 2-ship phase started again, kind of the 2v1 concept, and then it grew and grew and grew to where it was 2v many. And the threat simulated at that time, was the threat of the day in 1998, Su-27, MiG-29, etc. What we would consider now kind of gimme putts at that point, were not gimme putts. And it was my class was mixed F-18, F-14. I was flying C's. We did have one student who was flying A's, the poor guy, who was doing nothing but sparrow tactics. Andy Kessler, Chunder, God bless you, who stayed on the Top Gun staff with me. Actually, great dude. So Chunder had to fly A's, and the rest was flying C's with AIM 120s and whiz bang, what we thought were whiz bang mission computers at that time, and then the F-14 crew. So section phase was, I want to say eight hops, and then a little bit more academics, and then into division phase, which is the 4-ship for you Air Force people out there, 4-ship division, which was 6-ish flights, and the threat, and everything kind of ratcheting up. At that time, we also had what was a night week, which was really not a good idea, but we did do a night week, which was, we're at week 8 of a 10-week course. We're like, oh, let's flip everybody's circadian rhythm, and we're going to fly nights now for a week. Nobody's been flying night at all. Throw on night vision goggles and just try not to hit each other. And by the way, try not to get killed by a simulated threat. And then the last week was you finished up division phase, then you had a grad strike, which was pretty much every student that we could get out there against every adversary aircraft that Top Gun and the flight line had. And we typically, it was 10V, as many as they could get. And threat would, you'd kill somebody and you'd regen and come back in. And it was oftentimes an unwinnable problem, but it was kind of a cool way to end because everybody's all together. And so then we do grad strike, and then the next day was graduation, and everybody would curl into a fetal position for basically a week at that point. Like, thank God it's over, to include the staff, because the staff, it's a long 10, now it's 13 weeks. It was a long 10 weeks for everybody, students and staff. And, you get beat up. Days are long. First brief of the day is at 5:40, 3 goes a day, 5:40 brief. And if the staff, when I was an instructor as a lieutenant, we ended up, due to change of station, personnel change of station, like we were losing guys who've got certain quals. And so my last class, I was one of 2 or 3 division qualled instructors. And so bookending a 5:40 brief to the last go, and walking out the door at 10:30 at night, 11 o'clock at night. I mean, just these incredibly long days. So by the time you got to the end of it, you're just like, oh my God. So it's good when I went back as the CEO. I'm like, I'm not doing bookends anymore, but forcing the staff was much more healthy.
Yeah, and I forgot to ask. So, as the students go in, is it like the pilots and the Wizzos? Is it half Tomcat community, half Hornet community?
Yeah, so then we had, it was the only time they ever did it. We had a 4 Tomcat class, which was the last one they ever did because it wasn't sustainable. They would typically go 3, sometimes 2. We had a couple of air crew that were staying on the Top Gun staff. So in my class, we had 4 guys that stayed as instructors. Myself, Andy Kessler, Chunder, I mentioned, and then Art Delacruz Calsancato, who's the CEO of Rubicon right now. Which is a disaster relief company out here in the States, which is amazing, doing amazing work. And then Speedy Spadero, who was the pilot. So they were the Tomcat. Speedy's now a 2-star admiral. So Speedy and Cato stayed in the Tomcat. Chunder and I stayed in F-18. And they were flying the flight line's Tomcats. So they're flying F-14As. The rest of the Tomcat guys are flying fleet representative Bs and Ds. And so poor Speedy and Chunder were struggling through the movie Top Gun 2, when what's his face, Miles Teller gets in the back, he's looking like all these breakers. That's exactly the jet that they were flying, go through the students' Top Gun. And so we had 4 Tomcat crew, and then 6 F-18 crew. So they were all 5 Cs and 1A. Now, the numbers are roughly the same, but they'll do Super Hornet and F-35. And the Super Hornet side, you typically have 2 to 3 F crews. So pilot Wizzo, 2 to 3 E crews, and then now with F-35, just single seat F-35.
So what was the hardest jet to go up against as a student when you were going through Top Gun?
Well, so all the threats were simulated. The adversary simulated, so it could be an F-16 simulating a MiG-29 or a Su-27, or an F-14 or an F-18. So it was all about threat-based and what the current intel community assessed to be the high end. And like I said, it ratcheted up. You start off with some rear quarter only IR shooter, and then end up, at that time, Su-27 was sort of the big boy in the block, and then they were just starting to develop their own version of the AMRAAM, the AA-12 Adder, which is just like the AIM-120, not quite as capable, but so the tactics were basically all based upon the threat weapon and not the threat platform. The threat platform carried the threat weapon. And then you really just went, okay, what is the worst case scenario for that plane to carry? And that's what we're going to train to. And so looking back on, at the time, it was very cosmic and very difficult. Nothing like these guys are dealing with now. It's now, I mean, the Chinese threat and the weapons are just insane. I mean, the fights, all of our fights at that point, air to air, you would merge. Real world, you'd merge with falling debris or parachutes. That was the objective. Now, if there's ever a merge, it's you've done something wrong, or you've got to go that direction. Like, I've got to get to the ship. It's over there. That's where the chicken, the rice, and my stereo is. So I'm going that way. So I'm going to merge with whatever's out in front of me. But these fights are so far apart now because of technology that I look at what the staff and the students go through now, and it's kind of hard to wrap my old brain around to see what these guys are doing. Just like the Vietnam era, when these guys would come up and see what we were doing, they were like, holy smokes, this is way harder than what we were doing.
So let's get into a social level. What was it like being a Topgun student there? And did you mix with, the instructors? Did you go to the O Club and all that kind of thing?
Yeah. Some guys were friends with some of the instructors beforehand.
Right.
As a student, you're really head down kind of thing. And the class construct is such that especially my class, we were all so tight. And in the beginning, I was struggling, and everybody's kind of trying to rally around, like, help me out. And hey, I flew with this guy, and this is what he liked or didn't like. Think about that. And then as we moved through the section and division phases, I was doing well. And so, we all just kind of try to pick each other out. And some of my fondest memories as a student at Topgun were the weekends, like the whole class. We would go from Fallon to Lake Tahoe, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours away. And it was just, you needed that downtime. You needed just to be able to, okay, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to think about my next flight. I don't want to think about the next, the brief or whatever. I'm just going to go blow off some steam. And we, as a class, I mean, we would roll heavy with everybody, and it was awesome. And then, hey, I got the Monday morning at 5:40 brief. Guy would get up early Sunday morning, go back to Fallon and prep. And then we would, guys would go back and help them out. The week to week, there was still, interaction at the O Club. But the days were so long as a student that, you're going to the O Club would largely probably be just to get some food, not to go and drink a bunch of beers and get all banged up and then get ready for the next day. It was like, all right, I'm hungry. I've eaten enough Subway. I don't want to go out in town and eat McDonald's. Let's go to the O Club. The O Club has decent food, and have maybe a beer. Typically not. It was more like eat, go to the gym. Try to find whatever that stress release thing is, and then get ready for the next day. As an instructor, there was still, it's not like a caste system where like those are the students and those are the instructors and never the two shall meet, because the instructors are very, very invested in the student's success as well. And it was interesting, when you're a student, you don't necessarily think that or see it, but as an instructor, watching how passionate guys were to try to teach and make these guys better, because it's like having a toy, you or a model. You put the model together and you're putting all the pieces together, and you want to make sure that it looks good at the end and it's functional. And so you are really rooting for guys and gals to succeed, go to the class. And every once in a while, there may be a personality conflict in there that, screw that guy. But by and large, everybody's pulling for everybody to get through.
Yeah, on graduation night, I mean, what was that like for you? And did all the students going through pass, or do people fail? How does that work there, Proton?
My class, everybody got through.
Right.
Typically, and I attribute that. I literally attribute that to the fact that we were just this moving amoeba, and everybody was picking each other up. And in fact, when I stayed on as a lieutenant and an instructor, I would tell every class, like, hey, Topgun it's a little like golf. It's an individual sport. The two, the Tomcats and now the Super Hornet, the Fs. There's a pilot and a Wizzo involved, or a pilot and a Rio in the Tomcat days, and so there's a little bit of a team there. But
Yeah.
while it's like golf, it's also, the way you succeed is everybody does this together, and you help each other out and pick each other up. And the classes that were successful and typically had no attrites were the classes that embraced that philosophy, like, all right, we're going to help each other out. And the classes that had attrites were like, hey man, nice to meet you. Good luck. I'll see you on the backside side of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Graduation, I mean, honestly, it's kind of a blur. Because, as I said, by the time you get to the end of it, you're so just wiped out.
Yeah, I
and
imagine.
after my beginning, I was probably of 10 weeks. I mean, I was probably to week 7 before I started like coming back into that confidence level where, like, okay, I'm going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first 3 weeks were hell. And I was like constantly looking over my shoulder, like, oh God, I can't fail another flight. If I fail one, I'm out. And I didn't know at the time, but you sort of evolve. Like when you start flying with like the training officer and the standardization officer, you know that you're sort of now right on the ragged edge. And I had a couple of I had one flight with the training officer, and I had one flight with the stano. And and at the time I was like, oh, this is just my instructor. And then I got the stano, and then I got the training O. And then somebody said to me, hey, are you tracking what that means? I'm like, no, I know I'm getting my ass kicked. I know I'm not doing well. What more pressure can I possibly put on myself here?
Yeah.
But when that happens later on, that you start realizing. But by week 7, I knew I was good because I started succeeding in this section in the division phase. But at the very end, graduation itself, for me, I just, my grandparents came into town. Like, the people bring their families in, and they lived in San Francisco, so they drove over the hill. And I just remember thinking, thank God it's over. Thank God it's over. I just want to go and curl. And we all had that same, everybody. There wasn't like one student who was like, oh God, I wish it was another week. It was like, thank God it's over.
So, of course.
And then it was, I'll see you Monday. Graduation on a Friday, and, roll back into the staff on Monday. And I remember the training officer at the time was like, okay, dude, you can come in Tuesday. I'm like, thank you.
God.
I just want to go sleep. Yeah.